Welcome to Raise 'em Rugged, the podcast for parents wishing to raise confident, adventurous, anti-fragile children who are ready to take on life's challenges. Let's get started. So, Janelle Zwart, thank you for joining the early days of the Raise 'em Rugged podcast and show. And thanks for coming on a sunny Friday, being stuck in front of the computer instead of outside, unless you were stuck working anyhow. So we'll have some links to yourself and to Earthscape and the type of stuff you guys do with your playgrounds design. We'll get that linked in various show notes and that sort of thing. But can you give a little introduction to yourself, your background, work you do that's related to this Raise 'em Rugged idea, your own philosophies on raising children, as I understand a mother of two young children yourself? And then
absolutely. My name is Janelle. I'm a playground designer and project manager for Earthscape Play, and we are based out of Wallenstein, Ontario, so just about an hour and a half or so from Toronto. And my background is actually, or my schooling background, I should say, is in interior design. So I came out of school in 2013, and I just became a little bit disenfranchised with the interior design industry, and I was looking for something that had, I guess, opportunity to do design, but that felt a little bit more meaningful to me personally. So when an opportunity came up with Earthscape, they were looking for a playground designer, and this was pretty early days. We, I think, had only been doing playgrounds for 2 years or so at that point. Then I jumped in and have been here ever since. So it's been good. So we at Earthscape, we design and build custom wooden playgrounds. Primarily at this point, we focus on public spaces. So we do a lot of municipal parks. Our work is kind of all across North America. So we do the majority of our work actually in the States, but all over Canada, from the East Coast to the West, and a fair number of parks here locally too. And our structures are, when you picture a playground, it's probably very different from what our structures look like. They're built out of timber with wood cladding. Everything is untreated except for staining. So we have, some bright colors that we kind of sprinkle through. But we take a very artistic and sculptural approach to playgrounds. So a lot of our stuff is themed on maybe something that has historic or cultural significance to each site. And there's a lot of sculptural elements that go into it. And then we focus on risky play for sure as an important component of playgrounds that has historically been missing over the last couple of decades from public play space design.
Cool. Yeah, I'll say your structures are phenomenal. We've had our kids in Guelph. Is it a giant cricket or a giant grasshopper at the one park in Guelph?
Yeah, it's a water strider.
Water strider. I couldn't remember. And I've obviously been on your website, and we'll be able to float some pictures across the screen here of some of your structures. Are very, very unique. If people listening are imagining that you're a playground designer and they're picturing a metal swing set and a Home Depot slide set or something, this is not what we're talking about whatsoever. Everything you guys do are large pieces of artwork that are designed to be played upon, right? I think it's the best way to describe it that I can think of.
Exactly. Yeah. So it's quite a creative approach. Structures are really big in scale too, as you've probably seen. So we do big, 25-foot high towers where kids can climb like 18 feet in the air and then go whooshing down a giant tube slide, or big sculptures that they can climb on where, the outside of it might be like 12 feet up, let's say, and you can climb right to the top, that kind of thing.
Oh my goodness, how dare you? So a couple of things. For one, I'll point out, and I thought it was your guys' stuff, but I think it's a company out of Europe. I was in Tulsa several years ago, and there's this park there called the Gathering Place.
And
It has to be this 30 or 100-acre park, and I've never seen anything like the place in my life, mainly because in Canada we don't have things of that scale. And just the amount of children's play park area alone is as bigger than any municipal park I've seen in real life. And a similar style, I think, of structures, and I don't know exactly who that was, but just fantastical stuff. And I just picture I had fun. Me and a couple of guys were running around on it, and this is just a few years ago. And I can only imagine what that brings out in kids when maybe they're not familiar with your style of structure or playground, and their first introduction to it as they enter one of your playgrounds. Have you been able to witness that before, like the opening and unveiling for a community? And what was that like?
Yeah, it's a pretty exciting moment. Like I've seen it happen a couple times at schools, not in person, but just remotely getting to observe, and it's pretty fun. Anytime there's something new and exciting to explore, and you just sort of let the kids loose and let them have at it. It's really fun, and they just run all over and have to check everything out, and it's all new and exciting. Yeah, I just pulled up the Tulsa gathering place so I could remember what's in it. We weren't involved in that project, but I know there's some cool stuff there.
Yeah, it's something else. The entire park is something else. Just everywhere you go around a new corner, you're just blown away. And then you go around another corner and you're blown away again. Just not just by the scale of it, which is massive for a park project, but then it seemed in the quality and amount of detail in everything done, which often in my experience on real municipal scale stuff, the quality and the detail seems to diminish versus maybe a high-end residential work. But this seemed to have high-end residential quality on a municipal scale project. It was very impressive, not just in the playground, but in the patio spaces, the woodwork, everything. It was quite the spot.
Yeah, that's super cool. It's on my list to go and check it out sometime.
Probably worth the trip, especially you have young children. I said that after I got back. I said you could stay somewhere near that park and stay in a hotel for 4 or 5 days and just go there every day with your kids. And you would be like,
and see something new every time.
That's right. It would just, because your kids are so small, you would just go from place to place. And it'd be like going to an amusement park that is just a public park that has free access. That's really unbelievable.
Yeah, so we'll have to check it out sometime.
Yeah, Earthscape will pay for it because it's a product learning. It's a design trip, right? It actually truly would be. There'd be an amazing field trip if it wasn't 2 flights away. So
yeah, for sure.
So you're talking about the 12-foot climbing walls and sort of designing for risk.
Mm-hmm.
How, I guess 2 things is like, how do you know what's enough or what's too much and how far you can take it? Because there's obviously some regulatory limitations that you have to play within. And right. So it's understanding how, that that's good for kids, but then not to take it too far. And then also, are you getting demands for you to push that envelope to become adding more risk, or do you often want to add more, but then you're getting pushback asking you to safetify it a bit more? How does that all play out?
Well, I would say the climate has sort of changed over the last probably 7 or 8 years. So when we first started doing playgrounds, there was definitely a strong risk aversion that we would see with clients, especially with municipalities and quite often with parks maintenance departments, who would usually be responsible for looking after structures and dealing with it if there were problems. So that was something that we did initially really have to push for. And it sort of was inspired in large part by just the experiences of Mark Schwartz, our founder, who I think you know personally. So he has a couple of granddaughters, or grandchildren, I should say. There's 3 of them now in Australia. And so he had gone on these trips, 2 months at a time down to Australia to visit his son and the grandkids, and was just experiencing the type of playgrounds that they had down there, which are quite different from what we're used to here. The regulations around them are not nearly as stringent, and the standardization of products is not nearly at the same level that we've seen here. So there's a lot more creativity and kind of like individualism between different parks. So he saw that and saw how his grandkids were playing on those structures, got really inspired and wanted to do the same kind of thing here. So in the beginning, we did have to push a lot with municipalities and different clients to see the benefits of risk, but there are tons of great studies out there. So once we started to, make a good case for it and get clients to see kind of the benefits of risky play for children, especially developmentally, socially, and just understanding that kids are going to seek it out. Like, kids want risky play, right? They it's exciting, it's thrilling, it's fun for them, and it helps them to push their own limits. So they're going to seek it out whether you provide it in a playground or not. And if you're providing playgrounds that are not challenging enough, that are boring, then they're just going to seek it out in other, like maybe more inappropriate ways. So it's really like meeting the need of the kids who are using the playgrounds, trying to hit that, especially that upper age group. Our playgrounds in Canada are targeted for kids age 18 months to 12, or at least that's what the regulatory body has the standard geared towards. But I'd say it's pretty rare that you see a playground that's filled with 12-year-olds. Like usually by the time they get to that like 6, 7, 8-year-old range, they've outgrown the structures. And a lot of that has to do with the way they're designed and just not being high challenge enough.
Right. So then they go on to finding the local creek in the spring melt and breaking ice and getting, I'm speaking from my own experience, getting soaked and dragged away in the creek when you're young and running home and telling your parents you shouldn't go down there anymore. So you obviously just keep doing it. But is that
exactly
what you're basically relating to? Yeah.
Yeah. Or, getting into other behaviors that would meet that need for risk that might not be as appropriate, or
even
might
worse
be more
than playing
dangerous.
in a creek. Right, of course.
Yeah, totally.
Of course.
Things like climbing on the roof of the pavilion at the Ball Diamond or that kind of stuff.
Yeah,
right?
we did all that as well. Absolutely. Yeah.
Yeah.
You get on the roof in the garbage dumpsters, whatever it was, right? So what are some of the key benefits then for designing risky play, kids engaging in risky play that is still in a place that is in a way intentional rather than the back roof where no one can see them? So what are the cognitive benefits for children?
I mean, there's a big range, but one of the biggest benefits that I see is that it allows kids to evaluate risk themselves. It provides a setting where they can look at, say, a climbing feature and evaluate themselves, whether it's something that they can accomplish on their own, whether they're, physically strong enough to do it or agile enough. And if they are, or if they're not, or if they're sort of right on that borderline, then it forces them to make a decision about whether they're going to try it or not. So it's really pushing the ability of children to evaluate risk themselves and make those decisions in a setting that is appropriate for where they're at age-wise and developmentally.
Right. And then I imagine hand in hand with that, it must be something with a sense of accomplishment and confidence that would come with that when they're presented with a playground that allows them to do something that they didn't think they could, or maybe on their third visit there, they're comfortable doing it. There must be real confidence boosters with children who are allowed to take on risky behaviors and then are able to pull it off versus ones who are always sheltered from anything that might possibly hurt them. I don't know, but I can imagine, if someone hasn't done a study, I would imagine there is, that as those children progress into their teenage years, there has to be a much higher level of confidence between those two hypothetical children. Do you know of studies of that, or am I just making things up?
No, I'm sure there are. I don't know if I could name specific ones. I know we have kind of a library. I should look and see if I can throw you a couple good ones to read maybe afterwards. But yeah, you're right. Like they're definitely, you can definitely see the changes that happen when a child has the opportunity to make those evaluations and take risks and push their abilities a bit further versus kids who haven't had that opportunity. There's a project I'm working on right now in Toledo, Ohio. It's in our shop right now. It's going to be built later on this year, but designed 2 tall timber towers that have a series of nets that connect them. And then there's a big tube slide that goes down in between. So it's kind of this whole huge unit. And the tube slide at the top is only reachable by scrambling across through this series of nets and different climbers that are pretty high challenge. So the tube slide at the top is really the reward. You have to be strong enough to get up there yourself and brave enough, because it's really high, to be able to kind of push past that fear of being up, and obviously it's safe if you can't fall and, just hit the ground all the way down. There's, it's designed in such a way that to prevent that, but it's still, the feeling of it is still very open and very, very much risky in terms of like the decisions you need to take to get to the top. So that's a good example of that.
Right. And the kid will have to sort of push themselves in order to get there. Right?
exactly.
Oh, wow, that's very cool. Very cool. So on that note, like what are some of the most requested play elements that you get when you meet with community groups or municipalities? Is there something that's sort of the standout? Is something like that the very common? We want somewhere the kids can get up really high, because that fear of heights is so prevalent in humans that getting up and experiencing that, it's one of the biggest rushes, probably why skydiving, bungee jumping, roller coasters, all of it, right? Is that a common one? What are some of the main things you see?
Yeah, totally. Yeah, height is a big one. I would say anything that's really unique and kind of stands out from things that are offered in that geographic area are also in high demand. People want a playground that's going to be a placemaker and sort of put them on the map locally. So that doesn't necessarily always tie in with risk taking, but that's something that we see quite often. There are actually, I think it's Dr. Marianna Brussoni. Are you familiar with her or her work?
No.
Okay. She's one of the thought leaders on just risk and play and how the two intersect. But she's identified, I believe it's 5 main areas of play that children seek out taking risks. So play at heights is one of them. And I would say that's one that we draw on often in the playground realm. Moving fast is another one. So fast swings, fast slides, for example. Rough and tumble play is another one, which, that doesn't have as many applications in playgrounds necessarily, but that's one that we see.
You could just you could leave those big giant Q-tips with the foam things like from American Gladiator. You could just leave them lying all around the playground.
Yeah.
Then you'd encourage it.
Just big battering sticks.
Yeah. Yeah. Or like make a wrestling ring. Just make a wrestling ring. They'll know what it is. So go on, rough and tumble play.
Yeah. Rough and tumble play.
Yeah.
Being hidden or being lost is another one.
Right.
So that's obviously, we don't want to create places in public parks where children can actually get lost, but we do try to give a sense of enclosure and that kind of tight, small space that is dimensionally proportionate to a child, that it feels like they're hidden. So we incorporate spaces like that quite often. Mm-hmm. And that's one that I see with my 4-year-old actually all the time. She's always like running away to hide behind the tree in our front yard when I'm trying to get her in the car and that kind of thing. And then I think the last one, oh, sorry.
Go ahead. Go ahead. Finish the last one.
I was just going to say the last one is playing with tools and like dangerous materials. So fire and hammers and nails and that kind of stuff.
My 8-year-old yesterday, we got home after school and he wanted to stay outside. It was nice and sunny. I went in to make dinner and he's like, "Daddy, can I get that axe? Not the big one, the small one." Because I've taught them how to use axes. He has his own hatchet for, to use supervised or when we know he's been taught how to use it. I'm like, "Oh, what do you want that for?" He's like, "I'm going to build a fire pit. I need a shovel too. Do you have a shovel?" I'm like, "Well, buddy, the ground's frozen." But he was intent. He wanted a shovel. He wanted the axe and some rocks just in the front yard. Nowhere he's ever going to have a fire. But you can see what you're saying. It's a tool that's still a risky tool. He knows it has risk for him to have an axe and to use an axe, right? So what are you going to chop? Yeah. Well, just, some wood that I find around. Like, okay, well, not the bushes that are growing here, right? So wow, that all those things that you mentioned, I can picture with their own children that totally
it's
seek
easy
those
to
things out.
Think of them and draw examples. Yeah, totally. I know my daughter loves cutting things with knives too. Yeah. So she's 4, but when she turned 3, we got her a set of her own. They're just plastic knives, but they're serrated, so they and they have good grip and everything. So she'll sit at the counter and chop her cucumbers and whatever.
Right. That's a whole other side that doesn't relate to play whatsoever, right? But the age appropriateness of household chores and the importance of giving children chores even from that early age. And there are studies on that as well, right? The teaching responsibility, the realizing that a household is a team and you need to work together, the idea that nothing is just for free. I think a lot of this sort of stuff, including the risky play, like I was talking before about this, that it seems like when we were young, and definitely the generation before, it was probably too wide open. I've said I've had several major concussions, many when I was 15 and younger, because we didn't have helmets for anything. There's one where we need more safety in the world. If we had bike helmets and ski helmets, I would have not gone to the hospital on a couple occasions where I had to spend 1 or 2 nights because I got really wrong.
Mm-hmm.
There's a level of safety that was much needed, right? But then it's like
Mm-hmm.
a pendulum swinging a bit too far to the point of, the helicopter parenting, the bubble wrap children. And it goes also hand in hand with children not having any responsibilities and having everything given to them, all their disputes solved for them. And then you start to see the results of that in the children that get to, I believe I read just recently, and this was a real story, when kids in university are not getting good marks, their parents are calling out the professors to complain. And it's gone even further that after university and even into their 30s, if they're not getting the job they applied for, their parents are calling the workplace to complain for the child that they didn't get the job they wanted. And I think a lot of the stuff we're talking about, the getting your 4-year-old to learn how to help prepare dinner, to learn the risky play, to solve their own problems, climbing up a climber and have the confidence from it. I think these are really maybe the pendulum coming back to the middle ground, which is going to be a healthier spot for kids to be. And hopefully then as they get to be the 20, 30, 40-year-old age, they're not this stereotypical entitled millennial or Gen Z or whatever it is that has never worked when they're 25 years old and they've never earned their own money. How many stories do you know of 25-year-olds that have never had a job and earned their own money? I know far too many, and I can't even fathom that. I started making my own money at a paper route at 13 years old and never stopped. Like, I can't even imagine being 25 and not having the freedom of having your own income. Sorry, I hope that wasn't
Yeah.
you.
And no, it wasn't me.
Yeah, you're Dutch. It wouldn't have been
was...
allowed.
I think my first job was stacking firewood for our neighbor across the road when I was maybe 8 or 9.
Right. Exactly.
So I can relate to that for sure. It's I think you're totally right. And it, like, how debilitating to get to the age of, whatever it might be, university or graduating, and all of a sudden you're thrown into it, right? And then you have to just figure it out in that moment. Like, how much better is it to give kids opportunities to figure it out in settings where if they make a mistake or they screw it up, as a 4-year-old, if you make a mistake, the repercussions are so small, right? So learning to kind of navigate your way through that through childhood, I think, is really important, and is something that I think a lot of people could stand to be a lot more intentional about.
Yeah. And I think it is maybe there's a bit of a wave, which is what this podcast is all about. Is I don't think it's a wave as much as the pendulum swinging back a bit more towards the middle to a better ground that will raise children who become more confident, more self-assured, able to handle their own disputes, which are all the things you're talking about as well, right? With which you are doing through the way that you are designing playgrounds, I think is part of this bigger societal shift towards taking some of the bubble wrap off children, backlash against the trophy for everyone who participates, even if they lost, because guess what? You do lose. I think there's a backlash against the whole realm that said everyone's a winner and the kids can't have failure, and realizing that no, they need all that stuff, because we've possibly spent 20 years doing psychological damage to our youth.
It's kind of an interesting thing to think about generationally, how that has an impact. I do think there's a shift among parents of young kids, at least in what I see just with my peers and, other families that we know. Now, that might depend a little bit on where you live. Like, we're in a rural area, so I think the mindset tends to be a little bit more tolerant for things like risky play generally anyways. I think you could probably relate to that too, because you're in the area.
We live out in the country.
Yeah. One area that I'm curious to see if there will be changes in the next little while. Like, I think we've started to see it among parents and also in the playground world at kind of that municipal level. But when it comes to things like organized sports or any type of programming, that's where I wonder if we'll see the same changes or if it's going to be slower. Because I don't know if you've had this experience, but I noticed, like, my daughter's in junior kindergarten, even just, things like she'll get sent home with a waiver form to take the kids tobogganing at recess.
Right, at recess.
And they encourage the use of helmets. And then she comes home afterwards and tells me, well, the hill is really small. It's basically flat. And the kids have to line up and go down the hill one at a time. And I'm thinking like, okay, well, like you're coming home and then after school, we're going to the hill at the end of our street, which is, steep and has a forest at the bottom with trees you can hit and all this kind of stuff. And I'm, sending your 1-year-old brother down on a toboggan on his own. Like it just is such a stark contrast still, I think, between maybe that's just the school board. I don't know, but I do think it probably carries through to things like sports and other organized activities too. Do you see that with your kids too, or with your family?
I haven't seen waivers on things quite like that. I was actually surprised. My kids came home and they said that they play on the snowbanks at school, which I was happy for because I was under the impression that that kind of got banned years ago. Because, every couple of years, some kid would break an arm playing on the snowbanks. It just always happened, right?
Yeah.
So they didn't have to have a waiver to play on the big snowbanks, which would actually be more dangerous than going tobogganing on a flat hill, right? But yeah. I think, it's just the whole fear of liability and of lawsuits. And maybe it's our proximity to the United States in Canada that is the big rubbing off of that. And maybe that is what Mark experienced in Australia, is a less litigious society possibly than what we're so close to, and that allows more freedom. When you mentioned that, it reminded me of I was in New Zealand a long time ago, and there were just places that were just people knew about. And they were like underground caves full of like in the water up to your waist. And there was a sign there telling you what it was, but there was nothing roped off, no fencing, no one patrolling it. It was just a sign explaining it. And I showed up there with a friend, and we're about to go in this cave. We didn't have flashlights, and who let us in there was like a bunch of 12 and 14-year-olds who had an extra flashlight. We're all out there by themselves. And we're sitting here going, man, if this was at home, this whole thing is fenced off. There's a gate, there's a guard, there's a guide, there's a waiver to sign. Like, you ended up going back deep into this cave. And the society being different than here, I think, was the only difference. It's not the feature itself, right? But then that must ripple all the way through with everything and every interaction, right?
Yeah, and it sort of raises, or I think it creates potentially a false level of comfort in people's minds that somebody else is thinking for my safety. And so, if there's an area that I could explore, that has a cave or a body of water or something like that, if it's dangerous, it'll have a sign because somebody's thought of that. So maybe it's a bit of this sort of circular thing that happens where the safer we try to make stuff like that, the less people are thinking for themselves when they approach that kind of stuff. And yeah, I don't know if that makes sense, but
yeah. And it's like giving away the responsibility, right? It's like warning labels on products, right? You hear that every obscure warning on a product that to you would just shake your head and wonder why it's on there. It's because someone did that. Like the classic one is a lawnmower is not to be used as a hedge trimmer because some guy with his friend lifted it up to hedge and they cut their fingers off. And now it's explicit because guess what? That guy sued the lawnmower manufacturer and won because it didn't tell him not to do that. So in a way, there's some giving away of responsibility that goes hand in hand with all of this as well, right? Like, you didn't tell me, you didn't warn me. It's your fault that I got hurt. And then, yeah, it snowballs, right? So now I'm going to warn you, I'm going to protect you because I don't want to get blamed and sued. And then it maybe just repeats, wash, rinse, repeat,
Yeah, for sure. It creates an interesting opportunity, I think, then as parents of young kids, if you're taking them out, like I know you like to take your kids out on the river or, out to these kind of wild natural places, like teaching them from a young age how to be responsible for their own safety is, I think, another interesting component of the risk-taking conversation.
Yeah, I like the one phrase is I've listened to a fair bit of Jordan Peterson talk on parenting and some different interviews. And I think this is one of his is along the lines of you can make your children strong or you can keep them safe, but you can't do both. Which do you want to do?
Yeah.
If you're always keeping them safe, they're not going to be strong. This is his perspective as a psychologist, right? And obviously his answer is you need to make them strong. Because right now the world is safe in our corner of the world that is this protected little bubble on the globe that is really a fantasy land in North America compared to the rest of the world. But from his perspective, studying a lot of world history, he's like, you got to make your kids strong because you never know when things are going to change on a drastic level. It might not happen for you or them or the next, but either strong or safe, pick one. It's like, well, then that's pretty clear. Which one are you going to pick? You know?
Yeah, for sure. And I would argue that you can't even really keep them safe.
Right.
You can try, but at some point they're going to be out on their own, and they're going to be encountering things without you there to guide them as a parent. So you might as well just face the reality, I guess, and do what you can to prepare them and enable them to be able to react well in different situations.
That's right. You've probably heard the phrase that we've had posted as well and this, I came across, I think it's an old proverb, but I came across it from Jonathan Haidt, who was his book, Coddling of the American Mind. I've probably mentioned on every one of these interviews. It was sort of one of the trigger points where this idea came from, was a lot of the stuff out of his book. And it is, prepare the child for the road, not the road for the child.
Right? I like that.
Yeah, it's a fantastic phrase, and it ties right into everything, right? Everything. And I think there's been too much preparing the road for the child the past 20 years. Thus, the parents calling the professor when the child doesn't get a good enough grade, calling the employer when their child didn't get hired. They're attempting to pave a smooth road for their child even when they're 35 years old, right? And this can't be a good thing. These are future leaders, supposedly future leaders of the world,
Yeah, I like that a lot. Yeah, that's a good phrase. Just to tie it back to another playground example, I have a personal philosophy as a parent and, related to my work in playgrounds, but I don't help my kids do anything on the playground that they can't physically do on their own. So climbing, a climbing wall that's too tall for them, for example, one of them might ask me, oh, can you help me? I can't get to the top. And my answer is always, nope. If you can't get there on your own, then you should not be up there.
Right.
And that's one thing that you can see. And next time you're at a busy playground, just look around and observe, and you might see the odd parent who's trying to boost their kid up to a platform that's beyond their ability level, as an example. And it really does more harm than good. Like, for one thing, the child stops paying attention to their own body in the space and their own physical cues, and they start just leaning back on the parent who's holding them up. So they're not actually, the parent is essentially pushing their child to a height that is dangerous for them to be at, because they're not physically capable of being up there themselves. And and then once they get up there, then they have to figure out a way to get back down or to continue on. So that's that's one that I've kind of adopted as a personal rule, and I think it's a good one. And you will see kids, like, if you watch them, even if they seem like they're doing something that is dangerous, if you stop and give yourself like a 5-second pause to see how they behave, quite often they do actually have better physical awareness than we give them credit for. So you'll see them having 3 points of contact, for example, on something that they're climbing across, and paying close attention to where their feet and their hands are if it's starting to feel unstable or whatever. So you can really just kind of watch that process play out in their heads. It's pretty cool.
Oh, that's neat. That reminds me of a phrase I had heard where we always tell our kids to be careful, be careful, be careful, be careful. And it doesn't mean anything. And I try to catch myself because it's so easy to do it. And something I came across was, don't tell them to be careful, just point out to them what it is they're doing and ask them to think about what would happen if it, right? So if they're hopping across some wet rocks along the edge of a creek, don't tell them to be careful. Say, hey, what's going to happen if you don't put your foot in the right spot on that wet rock? And make them think rather than just give them a generic phrase. And that's one I try to remember. If it's climbing a tree, it's the same deal. Remind them, hey, make sure you always have 3 points of contact. Like, actually a coaching rather than just this generic, hey, be careful, which doesn't mean a thing.
Absolutely. Right? I try to use pay attention instead of be careful.
Right.
Pay attention.
Yeah, focus on what you're doing. Hand? Yeah.
Yeah.
That's
pay
good.
Attention. Is that stone under your foot loose, or is it steady? Like that kind of thing.
Right. I like it. I like the 5 points that you brought up. Marianna Brussoni.
Marianna Brussoni.
I'll write that one down. And going to the rough and tumble play, which you can't, we joked about, you could, I guess, into a playground, it probably wouldn't be acceptable. You'd be encouraging fighting. But again, that comes directly that I've listened to in another Jordan Peterson interview with, I believe, Warren Farrell, who has a book called The Boy Crisis, which really talks about boys in general and how in North American society, boys in particular have been falling behind drastically over the last 2 decades in every measure, every academic measure, you name it, falling so far behind, and relating a lot of it to our schooling system, which is really, you don't want to necessarily say that there's massive differences nowadays, but people who are parents of little kids can see that there are differences between boys and girls, and boys generally have a harder time being still. Boys are generally more aggressive, and the classroom environment being very non-conducive to little creatures that have such a hard time with this, that have aggression. And then they have recess periods that are so short they barely even get time to get their steam out.
Yeah. They
talk about rough and tumble play a fair bit, and the importance of it and all the different things that it teaches, right? For one, they love it. My two, it's one of their favorite things in the world is when we wrestle. So you can use it as leverage to have them do things, right? As a trade-off, which is always one of the multiple elements in the parenting toolbox, is the trade-off. You like to use that more often than the threat or the bribe. So
totally.
I prefer the trade-off. But then it's also understanding their own limitations, their own strength. It's understanding respect and how to hold back. It's understanding they know how much more powerful and strong you are. So it's showing that you're not hurting them, even though at any moment you could, and what that teaches them inherently. And then when they push it too far and you end the game, and then they learn that, hey, there's a difference between play and absolute aggression and physical harm. It's amazing what you think is just a little wrestling match, what it does and teaches. And evolutionary, from an evolutionary standpoint, you imagine there would have been all kinds of that all the time. It's not that we're still animals, but we're still animals. And you watch puppies figuring it out. That's how they figure it out, right?
Yeah, when you were talking, it totally reminded me of puppies. And especially if you ever watched a puppy and an older dog interact and how they play, it's the same kind of thing, right? Like wrestling, and the older dog will roll over and take the pose of submission and let the puppy, kind of climb all over them. But as soon as they've had enough, or the puppy goes too far, then they know about it.
They let them know pretty quick, right?
Yeah, I'm going to be interested to see how that plays out with my own son. I have 4 sisters, so we had rough and tumble play growing up, but I'm sure it was different than it would have been if I had brothers. So now that I have a 1.5-year-old boy, I'll be curious to see how that,
to see the difference side by side. And your 4-year-old is a 4-year-old daughter. Right. You'll have the lifetime experiment.
A lot
of people I know have 2 boys, including ourselves. And every time, we hear that someone else has 2 boys, it's always, everyone just looks at each other and says, oh, geez. Apparently the boys are like, they're more of a handful from 10 and under, but a bit less of a trouble in the teenage years, as was my wife's interpretation of it, is that the girls can be more of a handful and potentially more drama in the preteen and teenage years, where the boys are still just kind of goofs, so we'll see how it all works out. It goes by It goes by fast though. You blink and there's a decade gone. So
how old are your boys?
6 and 8.
6 and 8.
Yeah, 6.5, 8.5. So
super fun.
Nice. But fast, just fast. You don't realize it until you look back at some old pictures or old videos that are even 2 or 3 years old, and you're like, holy cow, how much they change in 2 years. You look at them from 2 years ago when they're 4 and 6, you're like, they're babies. But then it's like, what are they going to be in 2 years from now? You'll think they're babies now. So often reflect on that when you need to really appreciate, they can drive you crazy, but when you really need to appreciate who they are and what they are, I think the best way is to look back at the older pictures of them and realize that what you're looking at now is soon to be a past picture. It's just not there yet.
Yeah, it goes quick. That's for sure. Do you, now that you're in this process of, your Raise 'em Rugged podcast and videos and everything, do you have some I guess what's up next for you with your boys? Do you have some kind of adventures lined up that you're looking forward to in the next couple months or over the summer?
Yeah, some of our other stuff we've tented out before, but I've never had them on a backcountry camping. So we're going to work in something. We'll start small, likely just locally here along the side of the river, and then work up to doing, more you're up north, several day type trip. We've done sort of a halfway between that. It's basically like an off-grid bunkie out in Nipissing. They've been to a couple times. I don't have any footage of that, but so that will be one to work up to. They were in martial arts before COVID hit, so excitement to get them back into that. I think it ties directly into this theme as well.
Yeah, for sure.
I didn't do martial arts as a kid, but now I'm at the mindset that for a child, it should almost be essential. I think about the number of things that would teach in terms of, for one, just the physical abilities that it will give a child, but understanding fitness, self-discipline, mental discipline, confidence, respect, like everything about it. I picture if you had a kid in martial arts from 6 years old, and by the time they're in high school or mid-high school, they're a black belt if they stick with it, is what kind of mindset would that child have? I can only imagine, right? Like, what kind of confidence level would they have? What everything about it, I can just imagine being just a true superpower, as much mentally as physically. So
totally, yeah. I think anything like that can give your kids confidence in their own physical ability and mental ability is great for sure. We like to do lots of camping and stuff too, and starting to push some of the concepts of survival stuff for outside, and like how do you read the weather when you're out on a backcountry canoe trip, and water safety and all of those kinds of components that go into it. I think is obviously different than martial arts, but same, just kind of building that confidence and that capacity for understanding different challenges and things, I think is super important.
Yeah, you think they're different, but they have a lot of similarities. Our boys do a bit of team sports, but we're not super heavy into that. I think it has its place, but I think that team sports, learning to work in a team is important, but it doesn't have a lot of the same elements to it as far as building that risk taking and analysis. It's still a supervised, controlled space a bit more than the allowing children that sort of that free reign, free play, figure things out yourself, solve your own disputes type of stuff. It doesn't really allow for that. So I think something is needed, whether it's just from their neighborhood kids or a group or something, but the kids need a way that the parents aren't hovering all the time, and when the kids have a fight, they have to solve it and figure it out. I think that's something that has been intervened in a lot too much in the last 20 years as well, for kids not being able to solve disputes between themselves, right?
Yeah, that's an interesting observation.
Yeah, so that's about it. I do have the idea of doing with each of them camp out night where you have to build your own shelter, and we go absolute minimal, at least for the night, right? I think that would be cool. I read or listened to something years ago about, I don't remember who, but he created his own coming of age ritual for his two boys. You could do it for your two girls. And I don't know which age, or maybe he had tiered ones like 8, 10, and 14. And basically talking about how our society doesn't have any coming of age rituals, where most ancient societies for sure, and definitely less developed societies, you have your coming of age, now you're a man, now you're a woman type stuff. So he tried to recreate that just with his own family. And it sounded like a really cool idea, and it's secret to a way. So the 10-year-old can't tell the 8-year-old exactly what you went and did, because that's for them to find out. So I'm trying to put together a framework for that and what that might be. I wish really I could. Cool. Yeah. I wish I could say who I stole the idea from, but I can't remember. It was several years ago.
That element of secrecy and anticipation, I think, is great. That's super fun.
Right. And it has to be challenging, but you're not going to go and brand them, Or you could, I guess, but that'd be a little extreme. That's like, the Raise 'em Rugged thing isn't that we're trying to create our versions of the Spartans, and they have to go survive in the wild for 7 days when they're 9 or anything, but it's something that it's more so than what the general child rearing is right now, right? So some stuff like that. I'll leave you with one other, can wrap up. If you haven't yet discovered Jocko Willink for his leadership books. So do you know of Jocko at all?
I don't.
Okay, so he is a best-selling leadership book called Extreme Ownership, and it's really designed for organizations and corporations and this sort of stuff. He's like the stereotypical Navy SEAL. Like, he looks like G.I. Joe. He looks like if someone would shoot a bullet at him, the bullet would be afraid.
All right.
But, right. However, when you read his books on leadership, you picture this very militaristic, do as I say, blah, blah, blah. But it's the exact opposite. His whole thing is leading by example, listening, totally understanding the other person, all being on. It's a great leadership mantra, and his main 12 points of leadership are great for an organization. He has a series of children's books as well, which is pretty amazing.
Okay.
If you look up, one's called Way of the Warrior Kid.
Okay.
I won't tell you much about it, but I'll leave you with that to look up. And
all right.
They develop a warrior kid code, and you'll read it, and I think you'll like it. It has a lot of great ethics and morals to teach children, say in an absence, I don't know about your own background, but generally in society, in an absence of religious doctrine to hand down your morals and ethics. In a way, this creates something that could be seen as similar but relatable in everyday activities. So my boys, my 8-year-old, we've read through the series a couple times now, and he loves it, and it's really changed him. So
that's super cool. I'll check it out for sure.
And then as you read it, you realize how much you have to step up your game, because you have to live up to it as well. If the book is about getting the 8-year-old to live up to it, then you have to wake up early, eat well, and exercise too. So
totally. I'm if we're gonna do a book recommendation exchange,
yeah.
I'm pulling one up for you that I just read, and I couldn't remember the title, so I'm just pulling it up on my library account. But have you ever heard of, or do you know of Greta Eskridge? She's an author out of the States, and she's been interviewed on the 1,000 Hours Outside podcast recently, I think. Anyway, she wrote a wonderful book that I just happened to pick up from the library recently. It's called Adventuring Together, and it's just about getting out there, pushing yourself to do new things with your children specifically, and all throughout childhood, and just the ability that intention has to create connections with your kids. And it's a really good read. I highly recommend it. So she talks about, a lot of outdoor stuff, a lot of kind of this risk taking, pushing yourself past your limit stuff, but it's also adventures in other ways. So it's not just limited to that. So it might be things like taking your kids on public transit for the first time if you live in a rural area and they haven't done that before, or taking them to something that's totally outside of their normal realm of what they would do. So it might be going to a ballet or an art museum, or just pushing and looking for adventure, and kind of fostering this mindset of seeking it out in as many ways as you can as a family. It's a good read.
I like it. And what was her last name?
Eskridge. Eskridge. Perfect.
Good. I'll make note of that. And Marianna Brussoni gives me some homework.
Yeah. I'll send you some links.
Perfect.
Her stuff.
Awesome. Well, we wrap it up for there. It's a sunny Friday. We both maybe have a bit of work to wrap up before entering the weekend.
Yeah, just a little bit. And then we'll be heading outside. Yeah.
Awesome. Thanks a bunch for talking. We'll
Thanks,
be in touch,
Derek.
and maybe we'll do a follow-up sometime down the road.
Sure. Sounds great.
Thanks. Thanks for listening to the Raise 'em Rugged podcast. We'll see you again next time as we continue on this parenting journey. Be sure to like, subscribe, download, and rate the show. You can also find us on Facebook, Instagram, and other social media outlets.